Two Apache brides were hung for infertility. But a lonely rancher saved them. The village sat quietly between dry hills and wide open land, a place where mornings began with smoke rising from cooking fires and evenings ended with stories told in low voices. Life followed old rules here. People believed the past knew better than the present, and traditions were followed without question. Everyone knew their place, and stepping outside it was dangerous. Among the families lived two young women who had recently become brides. They were not sisters by blood, but they shared the same fate. Both had married into respected households, and both had entered their new lives with hope. They worked hard, showed respect to elders, and tried to please their husbands and in-laws. In the beginning, they believed patience would bring happiness, but time passed and whispers began. At first, the whispers were soft. Women spoke quietly while gathering water. Men exchanged looks during meetings. The problem was something no one talked about openly, yet everyone seemed to agree on who was to blame. The two brides had not given their families children. In the eyes of the village, this absence slowly turned into guilt. No one asked questions. No one considered time, chance, or nature. The belief was simple and cruel. A wife's worth was tied to her ability to give life. And when that did not happen, fear took its place. The first bride, gentle and shy, noticed the change in small ways. Smiles disappeared when she entered a room. Food portions grew smaller. Her words were met with silence. The second bride, stronger in spirit, tried to defend herself at first, reminding others that only a short time had passed. But her confidence was seen as disrespect. Soon the whispers turned into judgment. Elders met without the women present. They spoke of balance, curses, and dishonor. They claimed the land would suffer, that families would weaken, and that tradition demanded action. These words were heavy, spoken as if they were facts carved into stone. No one spoke in defense of the brides. Their husbands stayed silent, trapped between fear and obedience. Mothers-in-law looked away, choosing tradition over compassion. Even friends kept their distance, afraid that kindness might bring suspicion upon themselves. When the decision was finally made, it was not announced publicly. There were no drums or warnings. Only a quiet order passed from elder to elder. The village moved as one, slow and deliberate, as if what they were doing was unavoidable. The brides sensed something was wrong before they were told. That morning the air felt heavy. Birds stayed silent. The women were asked to step away from their homes and follow a group of elders. No explanation was given. When they asked questions, they were told to remain quiet. Fear settled deep inside them. As they walked, memories filled their minds. The first bride remembered leaving her parents' home, promising to make them proud. The second remembered laughing with her husband during the early days, when hope was still alive. Neither could understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. When they reached the edge of the village, the truth became impossible to ignore. The place was isolated, chosen carefully to keep the rest of the community untouched by what was about to happen. A few people stood nearby, faces tight with discomfort. Others refused to come at all. Tears fell freely now. The brides pleaded, not loudly but with broken voices. They begged for time, for understanding, for mercy. They swore they had done nothing wrong. Their words floated in the air, unanswered. The elders did not meet their eyes. To them, this was not personal. It was duty. That belief made it easier to ignore the shaking hands and sobbing breaths. Tradition, they said, had always demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice always hurt. The women were told their presence brought misfortune, that the village needed cleansing, that their fate was already decided. Each word felt heavier than the last, pressing down until hope struggled to breathe. The first bride collapsed to her knees, unable to stand any longer. The second held her up, even as her own strength faded. In that moment they clung to each other, two souls facing the same dark unknown. Around them, silence ruled. No one stepped forward. No one raised a voice. Fear of breaking tradition was stronger than empathy. The village had turned its back. As preparations continued, time seemed to stretch. Every sound felt distant. The bride's thoughts raced between disbelief and terror. They wondered if anyone beyond the hills could hear them, if anyone would care. They were not allowed final goodbyes, no chance to speak to their families. Their lives were being erased quietly as if they had never mattered. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows. Sweat mixed with tears. The women's breathing grew shallow, not only from fear but from the weight of betrayal. This was not just punishment, it was rejection by the world they had trusted. In their final moments of waiting, something shifted inside them. Fear gave way to a strange calm. If no one would stand for them, they would at least face the end with dignity. They straightened their backs. They held hands tightly. The elders took their places. The village stood frozen at a distance. Everything seemed set, final, unchangeable. And yet far beyond the hills, a sound carried on the wind, faint, distant, unnoticed by most. The story had not reached its end yet. His days followed the same pattern: feed the animals, check the fences, mend what was broken, and speak to no one unless necessary. People in nearby areas knew him as a man who kept to himself. He did not attend gatherings or celebrations. He did not argue about traditions or beliefs. He simply worked his land and let the world move around him. That was how he survived after losing the family he once dreamed of having. That morning felt different. As he saddled his horse, he noticed the air was heavy, almost tense. Even the animals seemed restless. The rancher paused, listening. Somewhere far away, carried faintly by the wind, was a sound that did not belong to the open land. It was not an animal. It was not the wind itself. It sounded like distress. He hesitated. Many times before, he had told himself not to get involved in other people's problems. Trouble followed those who interfered where they were not welcome. Still, the sound stayed with him, pulling at something deep inside that he thought had long gone quiet. He mounted his horse and rode toward the hills. As he moved closer to the edge of the territory, he noticed a small group of people standing far apart, their bodies stiff, their faces turned away from something unseen. That alone made his chest tighten. Communities did not gather like that unless something serious was happening. He slowed his horse and called out, asking what was going on. At first, no one answered. Then an older man turned and spoke, his voice low and uneasy. He explained that 2 young women were being punished for failing their duties as wives. The words were spoken as if they were ordinary, as if they did not carry the weight of human lives. The rancher felt a cold wave pass through him. He asked what kind of punishment required such secrecy and fear. The man looked away and refused to answer. Others nearby began to move, clearly uncomfortable with the rancher's presence. Someone told him to leave before he caused trouble for himself. But the rancher could not leave. He had seen injustice before. Years ago, he had lost someone dear because no one spoke up when it mattered. That memory had shaped his quiet life, filling it with regret. Standing there now, he felt that same moment rising again, demanding a different choice. He rode forward, ignoring the warnings. As he approached the clearing, the scene before him made his heart pound. 2 young women stood together, hands bound, faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Their clothes were dusty, their eyes red from crying. They leaned on each other for support, the only comfort left to them. Around them stood elders and onlookers, forming a circle that felt more like a wall. The rancher dismounted slowly, careful not to make sudden moves. He raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. His voice, when he spoke, was firm but calm. He asked for this to stop. He asked for reason, for time, for humanity. The elders responded with anger and disbelief. They told him this was not his concern, that he did not understand their ways. That tradition had already decided. The rancher listened, but he did not step back. He spoke of fairness, of how blame without proof destroyed lives. He reminded them that nature did not follow human schedules. That patience was not weakness. His words echoed in the open space, meeting resistance but also something else, doubt. Some of the onlookers shifted. A few lowered their eyes. The certainty that once filled the clearing began to crack. One elder stepped forward, accusing the rancher of disrespect. Voices rose. Tension thickened the air. The rancher knew he was risking everything: his safety, his land, his freedom. Yet walking away was no longer an option. He moved closer to the women, placing himself between them and those who meant them harm. His presence alone was an act of defiance. The women looked at him in shock, unsure whether to believe this moment was real. He spoke again, louder now, declaring that no life should be taken based on fear and superstition. He offered responsibility, saying the women would leave with him, that the village would never see them again. That balance could be restored without cruelty. The suggestion stunned everyone. Silence followed. The elders whispered among themselves. The decision they thought was final now stood challenged by a man with nothing to gain except peace of conscience. Time stretched painfully, every second filled with uncertainty. At last, an elder spoke. His voice lacked the strength it once had. He agreed to let the women go, not because he fully believed the rancher, but because doubt had entered the space and doubt weakened tradition's grip. The ropes were loosened. The women nearly collapsed as feeling returned to their hands. The rancher steadied them, his touch respectful and careful. He did not rush them. He did not speak unnecessary words. His actions spoke clearly enough. As they left the clearing, no one stopped them. The walk away felt unreal. Each step was heavy, as if the ground itself might pull them back. The women kept looking over their shoulders, expecting someone to call them back, to change their mind. No one did. When they reached the rancher's horse, he helped them mount carefully. He walked beside them as they rode, refusing to rush, knowing their bodies and minds needed time to catch up with what had happened. The land opened before them, wide and quiet once more. The village disappeared behind the hills, taking with it the lives the women once knew. Fear slowly gave way to exhaustion. Tears fell, not from terror now, but from relief. The rancher led them to his home as the sun began to lower in the sky. The small house was simple but clean. He offered them water, food, and space. He told them they were safe, that no one would take them from his land. The women listened silently, still unsure how to trust hope. That night, as darkness settled over the ranch, none of them slept much. The women lay awake, replaying the day again and again, afraid it might all disappear by morning. The rancher sat outside, staring at the stars, knowing his life had changed forever. He did not know what the future would bring. He only knew one thing for certain. He had chosen to act, and because of that choice, 3 broken lives had been given another chance to begin again. Morning came slowly over the ranch. The sky changed from deep blue to soft gold, and the land seemed calm again, as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside the small house, everything felt different. The 2 women woke early, unsure where they were for a few seconds. Then memory returned, heavy and sharp. Their hearts began to race until they heard quiet movement outside and realized they were still safe. They sat up carefully, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cows lowed in the distance. A door creaked. Footsteps moved across the ground. Life was going on, simple and steady, and that alone felt strange after what they had been through. The rancher did not rush them. He left food on the table and stepped back outside, giving them space. He understood fear well. He knew trust did not grow from words but from patience. The women ate slowly. Their hands still trembled, but the warmth of food helped ground them. They exchanged small looks, silent questions passing between them. Were they truly free? Would someone come for them? Could this man be trusted? When they finally stepped outside, the rancher greeted them with a nod, not a smile. He spoke gently, explaining where things were and what the day might look like. He told them they were not expected to do anything. They could rest as long as they needed. Rest, however, was hard. The first woman wandered near the fence, staring across the open land. She had never seen so much space before. Her whole life had been shaped by walls, rules, and watchful eyes. Now there were no limits in sight. The freedom felt almost frightening. The second woman stood near the house, arms crossed tightly, watching the rancher work. She had learned long ago that safety could disappear without warning. She studied his movements, his tone, the way he treated his animals. Everything about him seemed calm, controlled, and respectful. Still, her body remained tense, waiting for danger. As the day passed, the rancher worked quietly, fixing a broken gate and checking the water lines. He did not ask the women questions. He did not demand gratitude. He treated them like people, not problems to solve. That small kindness meant more than he knew. Later, as the sun reached its highest point, the women finally spoke to him. Their voices were soft, uncertain. They asked how long they could stay. They asked if he was afraid of trouble. They asked why he had helped them at all. The rancher paused before answering. He wiped his hands on his trousers and leaned against the fence. He told them he did not believe anyone deserved to be cast aside for things beyond their control. He said he had lived with regret once, and he would not live with it again. The women listened closely. His words were simple, but they carried weight. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, routines formed. The women began helping around the ranch, not because they were told to, but because movement helped quiet their thoughts. They learned how to care for the animals, how to mend clothing, how to cook meals using what the land provided. Work gave them purpose again. At night, they sat together on the porch watching the stars. The sky felt closer here, wider, filled with light. Sometimes they spoke of their pasts, carefully choosing words that did not reopen wounds too deeply. Other times they sat in silence, letting the night hold them. The rancher joined them sometimes, listening more than speaking. He shared little about himself, but the women noticed things. The way his eyes softened when he spoke of family. The sadness that lived quietly behind his calm. He was a man who had lost much and learned to survive without asking for help. Trust grew slowly, like a fragile plant pushing through dry soil. One afternoon, a visitor appeared at the edge of the land. The women saw him first and froze. Fear rushed back so fast it stole their breath. The rancher noticed immediately and stepped forward, placing himself between the women and the stranger. The visitor was a trader passing through, looking for water and rest. He carried no threat, but the moment left its mark. That night the women barely slept. The old fear had returned, whispering that safety was temporary. The rancher understood without being told. The next day he spoke gently but clearly. He told them this land was his responsibility. Anyone who came would answer to him first. He promised he would not give them up, no matter who asked. The words settled deep inside the women. They did not erase fear, but they gave it less power. As time passed, the women began to change. Their laughter returned in small bursts. Their shoulders relaxed. They began making plans, talking about learning new skills, about building something lasting. For the first time, the future did not feel like a closed door. Then, one evening, news arrived. A messenger from a nearby settlement brought word that questions were being asked about what had happened in the village. Stories had spread. Some people were uncomfortable with the decision that had been made. Others were angry that the women had been allowed to leave. The women listened quietly, their hearts pounding. The past was knocking again. The rancher remained calm. He thanked the messenger and sent him on his way. Afterward, he sat with the women and spoke honestly. Trouble might come, he said, but fear would not decide their lives anymore. They would face whatever came together. That night, the women talked long after the stars had filled the sky. They spoke of everything they had lost and everything they might still gain. They realized that survival was no longer enough. They wanted dignity. They wanted truth. The rancher watched them as they spoke, seeing strength where once there had been only pain. He knew then that saving them had not been the end of the story. It had only been the beginning. Beyond the ranch, change was stirring, and none of them could turn away now. The days after their rescue passed slowly, each one blending into the next as the women and the rancher settled into a new rhythm. The ranch itself became more than just a home. It became a place where life could begin again, where fear did not dictate every action. The women worked alongside the rancher, learning to care for the animals, mend fences, and tend the fields. Each small task brought a sense of accomplishment they had not felt in years. It was hard work, yes, but it was honest work, and it reminded them that their lives still had value. The first woman, gentle and reflective, found comfort in the routine. Feeding the chickens, brushing the horses, and gathering water in the early morning gave her a quiet focus. It was in these moments, when the sun rose over the wide, empty land and painted everything in golden light, that she began to feel a small spark of peace. She would pause sometimes, staring at the horizon, letting the wind carry away the tension that had built in her chest for so long. She began to remember what it felt like to breathe freely, without fear pressing down on her every moment. The second woman, stronger and more outspoken, found her strength tested in new ways. She was determined not to be broken by fear or past mistakes. She worked alongside the rancher to repair fences, fix gates, and care for the livestock. Each accomplishment reminded her that she could make decisions, solve problems, and contribute in meaningful ways. Slowly, the quiet tension in her shoulders began to ease. She began to smile more often, though cautiously, as if testing whether happiness could truly be allowed into her life. The rancher watched both women carefully, giving them space when they needed it, offering guidance when it was necessary, and never asking for anything in return. He understood their fear. He knew what it was to live with loss and suspicion. He had spent years alone, guarding his life and his land, never allowing anyone too close. But now he felt something different. A sense of purpose had returned, one that had nothing to do with work or survival, but everything to do with protection, trust, and human connection. He wanted them to feel safe, to feel that life could be better than what they had endured. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection and connection. The three of them would sit outside, listening to the sounds of the land, the wind through the trees, the low calls of animals, and the distant cries of birds. Sometimes they spoke of their past, sharing stories they had never told anyone else. Other times they sat in silence, letting the world around them speak instead. Slowly, bonds formed, not just of gratitude but of respect, trust, and even a tentative hope. One afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point, the women were helping with chores near the barn when a rider appeared on the horizon. The women froze. Fear rushed back, sharp and immediate. Memories of the village, the punishment, and the helplessness they had felt overwhelmed them for a moment. The rancher noticed immediately. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the women and the approaching rider. His presence was calm but firm, his gaze steady. The women looked at him, unsure whether to feel relief or panic. The rider slowed as he approached and called out that he was only a traveler seeking water and rest. There was no threat in his voice, and the rancher relaxed slightly, though his eyes never left the stranger. The women, too, gradually recognized that there was no danger. Still, the moment left its mark, a reminder that the world beyond the ranch could be unpredictable, and that safety was something they had to protect carefully. As the weeks passed, life on the ranch continued to settle into a rhythm. The women began to rebuild their sense of self. They laughed more freely, though the laughter was still tentative, careful not to overstep the fragile boundaries of their safety. They learned new skills, cooking from scratch, caring for animals, and even simple repairs around the house. Each task they mastered reminded them of their own strength and capability. Night times became a space for reflection and bonding. They would sit on the porch under a sky filled with stars, sharing dreams and fears alike. The rancher, who had long lived with solitude, began to open up in small ways. He shared stories of his past, of loss, regret, and lessons learned from years of living alone. The women listened, offering understanding without judgment. In those quiet moments, trust deepened. They realized that they were no longer simply surviving, they were building a life together, one grounded in respect, care, and shared experience. One day, the women spoke about the past openly, something they had not done before. They discussed the injustice they had faced in the village, the punishment that could have ended their lives, and the fear that had haunted them. They cried, laughed, and expressed anger, all under the rancher's watchful, steady presence. He did not rush them or silence their emotions. He only listened, offering strength without imposing it. That simple act of validation became a cornerstone of their healing. The rancher, in turn, began to feel changes in himself. For years, he had carried the weight of loneliness, of living without purpose beyond survival. Now, he found meaning in protecting and nurturing the women who had been cast aside. Their trust became a responsibility he cherished, their growth a quiet triumph. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, not just for them, but for the possibility of connection, of family, and of shared life. As life on the ranch unfolded, news from the outside world began to filter in. People in nearby settlements had started to ask questions about what had happened in the village. Rumors circulated, some expressing concern, others anger. The women listened to these reports carefully, their hearts pounding each time someone mentioned the injustice they had narrowly escaped. The rancher remained calm through it all. He reassured the women that they were safe, that no one could force them back into danger. His words were simple but firm, and slowly the women began to internalize the truth of their safety. They realized that the past might reach out to them, but they had allies, strength, and protection. Over time, the women began to imagine a future beyond survival. They spoke of learning new skills, helping others who might face injustice, and even building a life where fear no longer dictated choices. Their courage began to grow alongside their trust in the rancher. The bond between the three of them deepened, not out of necessity alone, but out of mutual respect, care, and shared resilience. The land around the ranch seemed to respond to their renewed sense of life. Crops grew steadily, animals thrived, and the days passed in a quiet harmony that contrasted sharply with the fear they had left behind. Evenings were filled with small celebrations, shared meals, stories, laughter. The women began to reclaim their voices, their autonomy, and their sense of worth. The rancher, who had once considered himself a solitary man with nothing to offer the world, discovered that protection, patience, and compassion could shape not only the lives of others but his own. He found joy in simple routines and pride in the growth of the women he had saved. He realized that courage was not always about grand gestures. It could be measured in quiet consistency, in standing firm when it mattered most. Through these months of rebuilding, all three began to understand a vital truth. Life could be harsh and unfair, but it could also be renewed. Safety, dignity, and trust were not gifts to be taken lightly. They were victories earned through persistence, courage, and human kindness. And as the sun set on the wide-open land each evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the women and the rancher stood together, watching the horizon. They understood that the journey ahead would not always be easy. Challenges would come. Fear might return. But they had each other, and that knowledge made them stronger than they had ever been before. For the first time in their lives, the women felt that the future belonged to them. And the rancher, once a solitary figure in the vast open land, realized that he was no longer alone. Together, they had begun to turn fear into hope, despair into courage, and survival into a new life filled with possibility. Months had passed since the rancher had rescued the two women, and life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. The days were long and filled with work, but they were no longer overshadowed by fear or uncertainty. The women had grown stronger, both in spirit and in skill. They had learned how to care for the animals, manage the land, and make decisions for themselves. Each small achievement became a step toward reclaiming the lives that had almost been lost. The first woman, once shy and uncertain, had begun to walk with her head held higher. She moved through the ranch with quiet confidence, her hands steady as she fed the horses or carried buckets of water. The daily work was no longer just a necessity, it was a form of healing. Each task reminded her that she had value, that she could contribute, and that the past could not define her forever. She smiled more often, though the smiles were cautious at first. Slowly, those smiles became more natural, a reflection of the safety and respect she now experienced. The second woman, who had always been strong-willed, grew even more determined. She took on challenges without hesitation, learning quickly how to mend fences, repair tools, and care for the livestock. Her confidence inspired the first woman and even the rancher, who had lived for so long in quiet isolation. Together, the three of them worked as a team, their bond strengthened by shared effort and mutual respect. Evenings were spent under the wide-open sky. The stars stretched endlessly above the ranch, and the women would sit on the porch, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. Sometimes they laughed and sometimes they cried, but always they found comfort in the presence of each other. The rancher joined them, offering guidance when asked and listening when they needed to speak. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, replaced by trust and understanding. News from the outside world began to arrive in small pieces. Travelers and messengers brought word of the village, the injustice that had been done, and the questions that were now being asked. The women listened carefully, their hearts beating faster with each report. The past was still alive, still capable of reaching them, but they were no longer powerless. The rancher assured them that no one could force them back into danger. They were free, and that freedom was theirs to protect. One day, a letter arrived from a nearby settlement. It was written by someone who had heard of the women's ordeal and their rescue. The letter expressed concern, offered help, and even praised the courage of the rancher who had intervened. Reading it aloud, the women felt a mix of relief and pride. For the first time, they realized that their story mattered beyond the walls of the ranch. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about justice, recognition, and hope. With this realization came a desire to give back. The women began to think about others who might face injustice, who might be powerless against the harsh rules of tradition. They spoke of helping, of sharing what they had learned, and of standing up when no one else would. Their voices, once silenced by fear, grew stronger with each passing day. The rancher supported their plans, offering guidance and encouragement. Together, they began to see a purpose greater than themselves, a way to turn their pain into action. The bond between the three deepened in unexpected ways. They became more than rescuer and rescued. They became family. The rancher, who had once considered himself a solitary figure, discovered the joy of connection, trust, and shared life. The women, who had once felt disposable and powerless, found strength, dignity, and the ability to shape their own destinies. They laughed together, worked together, and supported each other in ways that no one else could. Life on the ranch was not without challenges. Harsh weather, stubborn animals, and the demands of the land tested their patience and resilience. Yet, each challenge was met with cooperation, problem-solving, and growing confidence. The women learned to trust their instincts, to rely on each other, and to face difficulties with courage. The rancher, too, discovered that leadership was not about command, but about care, understanding, and steady guidance. As the months turned into a year, the women began to imagine a future that had once seemed impossible. They spoke of expanding the ranch, of creating a space where others could find safety, and of teaching what they had learned to anyone in need. They imagined a life where fear did not dictate choices, where kindness and courage were stronger than tradition and judgment. Their dreams, once distant and fragile, began to feel tangible. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the three stood together on a hill overlooking the land. The ranch stretched wide below them, alive and thriving. The animals moved peacefully, the fences were strong, and the home they had built together stood as a symbol of their resilience. The women held each other's hands, and the rancher stood beside them, quietly reflecting on how far they had come. In that moment, they understood a truth that had taken months to reach. Life could be harsh, unfair, and unpredictable, but it could also be renewed, rebuilt, and cherished. They had faced injustice, fear, and despair, and they had survived. Not just survived, but grown, healed, and transformed. They were no longer defined by what had been done to them, but by what they had chosen to do with their lives. The rancher finally allowed himself to imagine a future he had long believed impossible. He could see laughter, shared meals, and quiet evenings filled with stories under the stars. He could see the women thriving, their voices heard, their courage recognized. And he could see himself not as a solitary man, but as part of a family that had been built through trust, compassion, and action. The story of their rescue had become more than an act of bravery. It had become a symbol. It showed that one person's courage could change lives, that standing up for justice could break cycles of fear and oppression, and that hope could be restored even in the darkest of circumstances. And as they watched the sun disappear below the horizon, the women and the rancher knew that their journey was not over. Challenges would come, memories of the past might still linger, and life would continue to test them. But they also knew that they were no longer alone, that they had the strength to face anything together, and that their future belonged to them. In that quiet moment, filled with gratitude, determination, and hope, they felt a deep sense of peace. They had been through the worst and had emerged stronger. The ranch was more than land and animals. It was a sanctuary, a home, and a symbol of what courage, kindness, and trust could accomplish. For the first time, they believed without doubt that they could live freely, safely, and fully. And in that belief, they discovered the greatest gift of all, the power to shape their own destinies, no matter what the past had taken from them. The women, once victims of cruel judgment, had become survivors and builders of a new life. The rancher, once lonely and isolated, had found family, purpose, and a renewed sense of hope. Together, they faced the future with courage, compassion, and the unshakable knowledge that life, when nurtured with care and respect, could be beautiful again. And so the story ends not with fear or despair, but with life, resilience, and the promise of all that was yet to come.